we will look at the ideologies and actions of another British individual who is continuously praised in modern British culture. Winston Churchill is another open white supremacist who is often touted as Britain's finest hero. As well as having been voted the greatest Briton in 2002, Winston Churchill now occupies a place on the £5 note. He played a key role in the construction of apartheid in South Africa, and was solely responsible for the imprisonment and torture of around 150,000 Kenyans in concentration camps. Despite this, historians such as Richard Toye have argued that whilst Winston Churchill was undeniably a white supremacist, he didn't necessarily advocate the harm of non-whites. His indifference towards the acts of genocide committed against native populations suggest otherwise. In 1937, he made a speech in Palestine saying, open quote, "I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wise race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place." End quote. This certainly suggests that he had no issue with the harm of non-white peoples, and perhaps even strongly advocated it. In fact, during the Boer Wars, when considering the large numbers of black South Africans dying in concentration camps, Churchill wrote that his only irritation was the fact that Kafirs were allowed to fire on white men. It's essentially impossible to argue that Winston Churchill was not an open white supremacist. John Charmley, the author of Churchill, The End of Glory, states that Churchill saw himself and Britain as being the winners in a social Darwinian hierarchy, where white Protestant Christians were at the top, above white Catholics, whilst Indians were higher than Africans. Now this is important because Churchill is another person, as previously mentioned, who is considered an architect of apartheid. In July 1906, Churchill argued passionately that white South Africans should be allowed to rule themselves and disenfranchise black South Africans. The policies that Churchill put in place to denigrate the black population were so forceful that when 4 years later Churchill's successor tried to undo them, this proved impossible. Some historians argue that the mitigation for Churchill's opinions on race is that they were relatively normal views to have at the time. However, his open white supremacist views and advocacy of chemical warfare and brutality against native people were considered distasteful and extreme even by some of his contemporary peers. So back to the question as to why then was this man voted the greatest Briton of 2002 by the British public? And more importantly perhaps, why is this the person that was chosen to go on the £5 note in 2016? Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, alleged that Barack Obama had removed a bust of Winston Churchill from the Oval Office. What Bojo forgot to mention is that Barack Obama's grandfather was imprisoned without trial and tortured for over 2 years for resisting against Winston Churchill's oppressive regime in Kenya. Now let's forget the statues. This man is on the £5 note. Some historians might argue that yes, he was able to lead Britain through World War II. However, as a white supremacist, that is not out of character. Let's not pretend that this was out of a sense of humanitarian aid. Churchill simply wished to preserve the well-being of a race which in his mind had a right to dominate the rest of the world. So essentially means that we are okay with white supremacists as long as they protect us when we need help. Again, the dual feels of domination of resources and boosting his own personal ego are identifiable as strong factors in his white supremacist ideology. Next, we will revisit the theme of genetic survival as we discuss one of history's lesser known genocides.